Arts and the Goodman School of Theater. He toured as an actor in Tobacco Road. In Indianapolis, Don Wayne got his first radio job and his name. The station manager of WISH said that the name Wesley Wayne Bauslog just didn't have any zing. He suggested the young announcer keep the Wayne part and put something in front of it. John Wayne was taken. How about Don Wayne, he said. And Don Wayne it was. A few months later, WKMO Radio beckoned Don Wayne to Kokomo, Indiana. In Kokomo, Don met and married wife Louise. And there, just weeks after Pearl Harbor was attacked, the program director of WHIO Radio happened to hear one of Don Wayne's broadcasts. He, too, knew a one-in-a-million voice when he heard one. And on January 22nd, 1942, Don Wayne was on the air in Dayton. A full year before Channel 7 officially went on the air, Don Wayne became involved in television. That year was 1948. WHIO TV was Channel 13 back then, an experimental television station. Even then, Don had a style all his own.
Policemen, picket lines, speeches, arguments, arrests. Meeting.
One of Don's first television presentations was this 1948 newsreel documenting a 9-day confrontation between local strikers and Dayton police.
So before we unroll our cameraman's film to fit the puzzle together,
his dramatic style of delivery would become his trademark throughout his career.
In those days, the newsreels you saw in the theater were highly dramatic, as the narrator would put it. And I guess I picked up the style primarily from that. You know, in every journalist, electronic journalist, there has to be a little actor. You've got to dramatize things. You just can't read them and not essentially provide some impact with the audience. You have to gather the audience's attention. Then you've got it.
In those early days of WHIO TV, Don spent most of his time directing. He directed live reports from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to Edward R. Murrow's See It Now program on CBS, thanks to a phone call from a friend who was also Murrow's producer.
And he said, we need a director. And I was directing at that time, not working as a journalist or a broadcaster. And I said, that's great, Johnny, just let me know.
So now we will go out along the coaxial cable to test hangar 65 at Wright Field. These are the same straps that are used actually in the cockpit of an F-86.
WHIO TV signed on the air as Channel 7 in 1949. Within the next 2 years, Don Wayne became the entire news department. Anchor, reporter, photographer, film editor, and news director. A job he once said he got because of a man who smoked a pipe.
Stewart would sit on a desk and do a 5-minute newscast, and he always had a pipe in his mouth. And sometimes it was hard to understand what he was saying. So the manager called him into the office and said, take the pipe out of your mouth. I don't want to see it. Well, the same evening, Mr. Strand appeared, seated on the desk in the studio with the pipe in his mouth. And the next day, Mr. Strand was looking for a job. And the news director's position and news presenter was handed to me.
So maybe we should thank the man with the pipe. For the next 4.5 decades, the Don Wayne came into our homes every night with the news. I'm a lucky man to have worked with Don Wayne and to have learned from him. And there are many other lucky people, reporters, anchors, photographers, editors, directors, executives who have worked with Don and learned from Don Wayne. Don's best-known co-anchor worked with him in the late 50s and early 60s, then went on to become a broadcast pioneer in his own right. He did it with a talk show that was sort of a television descendant of the old WHIO radio program, Conversation Piece.
That's the sign of good, clean living, which is what Don Wayne did.
Phil Donahue speaks lovingly of his friend and colleague, Don Wayne.
It was a wonderful, wonderful time. I would love to live it over again. And as with all things good, I never really appreciated how lucky I was to work with this man. until later.
Donahue says Pappy was the leader in our newsroom from the start.
Because he was the cool, professional, mature figure surrounded by a lot of young people who had no idea what they were doing, but were all, including me, we were all going 70 miles an hour.
Despite the craziness in the newsroom, Phil says Don was always a gentleman.
A man who never swore, never lost his temper, was never late for work, impeccable dresser, and a very generous person who never ever said anything mean. I don't remember him saying anything mean.
Like many of us, Phil also remembers Don's sense of humor and his genuine love for viewers here in the Miami Valley.
And he loved to be recognized. He loved meeting people. In a world where celebrities appear occasionally to be hard-pressed to, give an autograph, I think he would have parked their car.
Phil Donahue says knowing Don Wayne made him a better person. He says no one will ever achieve what Don did.
He was #1 all his life. That's going to be my story in my next life, if I can get him to co-anchor with me again.
Phil is certainly more famous beyond the Dayton area, but Don Wayne will always be the Miami Valley's favorite.
Excellent newsman and just a good, well-rounded and very nice person. I've always thought a lot of him.
He seemed genuine and kind and sincere in everything that he said. He seemed like everybody's uncle or grandfather.
Don Wayne's goal was to bring you the best coverage of Miami Valley news every single day, and sometimes that meant traveling far from home. Vietnam was a dangerous assignment, but Don Wayne was there. When U.S. hostages were freed by Iran, they first went to Germany, and Don Wayne went there too. He covered stories the whole world was watching. Ken Jefferson remembers.
When most of us think of Don Wayne delivering the news, we think of him doing it from the desk in the confines of the studio. But what you may not remember are the times when Don went abroad to report us the news from other parts of the world.
And from this city, and from many other cities, Cam Bay, Tonsanut, from Benoit, reporting for the Dayton Power and Light Company, we shall bring you this special report.
The year is 1966, and the United States is involved in the Vietnam conflict. Don Wayne, along with photographer Chuck Upthegrove, was the Miami Valley's first news team into the troubled region. And Don, with his classic style, didn't shy from asking direct questions.
We're rather befuddled back in the States sometimes as members of the press, because we see reports consistently of engagements between the U.S. and South Vietnamese government forces and the VC, and it's always stated that our casualties are light, casualties are moderate. Is this always true? Or is this what they're telling us?
In most cases it is, yes.
It is true.
They, the headquarters down here have a formula worked out to determine the casualties, and it's true.
After more than 400 days in captivity, Iran releases American diplomats, among them Daytonian Steve Lauterbach. Don traveled to what was then West Germany for their homecoming.
It's 5 a.m. on a Monday, January 19th, here in West Germany. Dawn's approaching, and at this hour now, since we know that the documents are completed and it's all official, there is an agreement between Washington and Tehran. Everybody here, of course, will be preparing to welcome the hostages to West Germany.
In the years I worked with Don, I've never seen him walk away from a good story. His enthusiasm for his profession became a personal and professional inspiration. And finally, take a look at some rare footage of Don arriving home to his first wife, Louise, and family. This is the Don Wayne you seldom saw, but one I'll never forget.
Don Wayne covered the news no matter where it happened. Yet some of the biggest stories happened right here in the Miami Valley. But Don was just as good at covering a story affecting the entire nation. Cheryl McHenry remembers.
Don Wayne was not merely a broadcaster, he was a journalist, and all of us who grew up in the Miami Valley trusted Don to give us the news. In the mid-60s, Don interviewed a young test pilot from Wapakoneta. A somewhat nervous Neil Armstrong would later become the first man on the moon.
Notice here in the hangars that all 3 of the X-15s are torn down for maintenance work. Does this mean that there is no flight scheduled for the near future?
Yes, there'll be no flights in the immediate future. Our dry desert has been very fortunately blessed with nice large rain.
Don was as much a part of the history of the Miami Valley as were the events that shaped our local history. In 1974, Don was on the air continuously as Gil Whitney and the Channel 7 news team warned us about the killer tornado that hit Xenia, then covered its tragic aftermath. In the summer of '76, Don interviewed President Gerald Ford and scooped the nation about a change in the administration's policy toward desegregation.
In an interview with Don Wayne of CBS affiliate WHIO in Dayton, Ohio, Mr. Ford gave an outline of just what that legislation will entail.
What it provides is that if there is segregation,
that voice, that presence, the way he conducted himself, all made him the Don Wayne we loved and trusted to tell us the everyday stories and the big stories we all remember. When Dayton firefighters went on strike in 1977 and buildings burned out of control, we looked to Don Wayne to tell us when the strike would end.
Good evening, everyone. There's very little hope for a quick settlement of the Dayton firefighters' strike. Negotiations broke off again early this afternoon.
When we were stranded by the blizzard of 1978, we watched Don Wayne till we could dig ourselves out. In 1980, Don interviewed presidential candidate Ronald Reagan.
The argument is that the federal government is...
While in Washington interviewing Vice President Bush, Don gave live reports on the ill-fated Air Florida flight that plunged into the Potomac River. In 1984, Don rode along on President Reagan's whistle-stop campaign tour of Southwest Ohio. When tragedy struck the nation's space program in 1986, the Miami Valley learned about the Challenger explosion from Don Wayne.
Everything appeared normal as the Challenger roared into space. Then came an explosion, clearly visible from the ground.
Later that same year, Don led the Newssetter 7 team as we covered the train derailment and phosphorus fire in Miamisburg, which forced 30,000 people to be evacuated from their homes.
Now let's join with Cheryl McHenry live.
Don, the firefighters are still working on the fire. I don't even know if you'd call it a fire at this point. There's a little bit of smoke. Don's hair may have thinned over the years, but that distinctive voice remains strong. His credibility impeccable. That's why he'll be remembered as the Miami Valley's best known and best loved broadcast journalist.
Beloved news reporter and much more. Remembering Don Wayne returns in just a moment.
I remember coming to the Dayton area in 1967 and tuning in to WHIO and listening to a gentleman who I thought was probably the best news voice I'd ever heard.
Just a great, kind fellow. That's all I can say.
Welcome back to our special report, Remembering Don Wayne. Don delivered the news to Miami Valley listeners and viewers for 46 years, so his final broadcast here was more than just a newscast. It marked the end of an era. April 27th, 1988 was the day Don Wayne retired. He left the news desk the same way he arrived, with poise and professionalism.
From the Miami Valley's leading news station, this is News Center 7 at 6 o'clock with Don Wayne. Jim Baldridge, AccuWeather with Bruce Asbury, and the Sports with Mick Hubert.
I'm Jim Baldridge.
And I'm Don Wayne. At the top of the news, details are still unfolding in the bizarre death and burial of a Dayton newspaper's employee. The victim's husband, also employed by the paper, has been arrested and charged with murder. Cheryl McHenry has more on this grisly tale. And a young Troy man is lucky to be alive, according to police, when a front-end loader he was operating this morning struck the side of a moving freight train in Troy. 22-year-old Timothy Evans of West Race Street was treated at Stoddard Memorial Hospital in Troy for a back injury and later released. This evening, I conclude 46 years of full-time employment with WHIO. Now, the years I have spent with this organization have been exciting, challenging, and extremely satisfying. And to you, the residents of the Miami Valley, I sincerely thank you for your support. You have played a major role in whatever success I can attribute to my long career as a broadcaster and a journalist. You, as television viewers, have accepted me as a trusted friend. You have invited me into your homes for over 4 decades, and I shall always be grateful for the fact that I was accepted as a member of your family. Well, one more time, this is your new News Center 7 anchor team, Jim Baldridge and Deborah Countess. And for Deborah, a kiss on the cheek, and for Jim, a warm handshake.
Thank you, Don.
My congratulations and best wishes.
Most of us will never, ever forget Don's last show at WHIO TV, but his career achievements are not our only memories today. We remember Don Wayne for the man he was off the air, too.
You can't remember Don Wayne without remembering his sense of humor and how much that could really brighten your day and how much it could take a tough situation and make it funny.
Don used to like to tell famous stories and jokes sometimes, and when he'd get to the punchline, Don would often break up and couldn't finish the story. He had charisma, he had personality, he had a sense of humor, although I will tell you, Don Wayne told some of the corniest jokes I've ever heard in my life.
I remember sometimes people would tell him a joke right before he went on the air, and he'd kind of chuckle a little bit about it. And then a few minutes later, he'd get to thinking about it, and he was doing the news, and then he'd break out laughing, and he would be trying to do the news and contain himself, but he'd be laughing so hard, and people would talk about it for days. Oh, I saw Don Wayne laughing on the air the other night. And people loved it because they loved to see that side of him.
I never saw the man angry. If a story wouldn't go right, or if we lost a video, or we didn't have all the information, it didn't bother Don. Now, it might have upset him, the fact that the story may not have been the way he wanted it. He never showed it. He never yelled at anybody. He was never mad at anybody.
When the good Lord made Don Wayne, he literally threw away the mold. The man was, I never saw him get mad. I never saw him say a nasty word about anybody. I never saw him be anything except a total, complete professional.
That was the word you would use to describe him, was class. He was gracious. He was charming. He was very giving of himself. He was very generous with himself and with his experience and his wisdom, although I'm sure Don would think wisdom was much too pompous of a word to use, but he was very wise and very intelligent.
I saw Don walking over. He was in the crowd and he was coming over to me, and he looked at me and he says, you know, he says, I watch you sometimes. And I said, thank you. And he says, you're very good, but you should be working for Channel 7. And I knew he was right. And then years later, when I came to work for Channel 7, the very first day on the job, I looked down and on my desk, I found this telegram. And it was a telegram from Don. It says, from one seasoned professional to another, from your retired colleague and friend, Don Wayne. I'll never forget him.
As a professional, he was that. He was a consummate, hardworking, a guy that truly loved our business. But yet he was a private person when it came to his family, and when he left here, a very public business, but a very private person with a very, very infectious sense of humor.
He probably was the friend of more people in the Miami Valley than there ever was before or ever will be again. People welcomed him to their home.
Don Wayne, fortunate to work with him, fortunate to know him, God rest his soul.
We can either think about what we've lost, which is a very, very special person, or we can focus on all of the things that he gave us over the years. I know that's what I'm doing, and they're very, very happy memories of Don Wayne.
I just love the guy because he was just Don Wayne.
Pappy, we're going to miss you.
Don was one of a kind, and I'm really proud to say that he was my friend. So long, Don.
People tend to stay a long time here at WHIO, and especially in the early days, families got to know and to love each other. Don and Lou had a wonderful family, 4 children, Beverly, Sherry, Dave, and Tim. They were blessed with 4 grandchildren and 48 years of happiness together. Louise died in 1990. A few years later, Don met Pat Cook. Don and Pat were married in early 1996. Pat was at Don's side for his first cancer battle, which we all thought he had won. And she suffered with him through the final battle that he did not. Viewers love Don Wayne, like family, too.
He's just like a member of the family. He's just been in our living room since I've been in Dayton.
I like what he stood for, like the way he handled it.
I enjoyed his program. He did an excellent job, and I think he was admired by everybody.
My generation of broadcasters, just now reaching middle age, stands on the shoulders of giants, pioneers who are slipping away. Don was a father figure and a mentor to me and to many, many others. We follow in their footsteps, but we can never fill their shoes. Don Wayne's funeral was a celebration of his life. He would have really liked it. Don Wayne will always be a part of the Miami Valley and our memories.
Once again, to those among our television audience, I thank you for your loyalty and support, and God bless you. We'll be back in a moment.